Welcome to another webinar in the series for University of Data and Publishing. My name is Dan Humm Soriano, and today I'm going to be talking to you about project-based learning. Some of you may have seen the previous webinar, the previous Facebook Live, which was the action-oriented approach by Eduardo Hernandez. That was in last year in November. If you didn't see that, do not worry. It's not a problem. You don't need to see any of the information from the previous webinar in order to understand this one, but those that did may see some of the similar references. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about project-based learning, and what I want to focus on is that project-based learning is an opportunity for a journey. It's a journey for students, because students have the opportunity to pick up knowledge and skills and language as they produce the project and as they work on the project. So first I'd like to begin by just a quick introduction and explaining some of the key points that are in the 2017 CEP program. So if you are familiar with the Aprendizajes Claves document, you may know that the focus of the CEP is on communicative acts, social practice, and on the product. And the idea is that the students need to have opportunities to participate in a variety of communicative exchanges which demand the use of knowledge, skills, attitudes and strategies. And the idea is that those opportunities are what allow students to reflect on the different aspects of the language and culture. So the idea is that as students focus on doing a task or doing a project, they are learning. And this concept of learning through doing, I'm sure you're fairly familiar with. If you happen to be a teacher here in Mexico, then you'll be familiar with both the PNIEB, which was in 2011, and the PRONI, which is 2016. And you'll know that the concept of learning through doing is a very important concept in both of those programs. Even if you're not here from Mexico, then you will also be fully aware that this is a very common concept in education, and that the idea of learning through doing is an incredibly not old, as in out of date or old-fashioned, but it's an idea that has been around in teaching for a very long time indeed. In fact, some of the ideas originated from the work of John Dewey, and John Dewey famously said that education is not a preparation, education is life itself. And the idea behind that is that as students are learning, they are engaged in producing something, they're engaged in an activity, and that activity is part of their life. So therefore, it's not about giving them the information, giving them the knowledge, giving them the language that they need in order to participate in life at a later date, but instead that they are engaged in something in their life right now which will help them to continue in later projects and other similar situations. So the reason that I'm using an upside down pyramid in this slide is that the communicative act kind of takes precedent above social practice, which takes precedent above product. And it's very easy in project-based learning to get extremely focused on the product. And actually, it's important to keep these different elements in mind. And as I said before, if you happen to see the webinar from November, then you will have heard these ideas, the idea of communicative acts and social practice. But never the same, I will explain them now. So the project-based learning is very similar to task-based learning or what was explained in November, the action-oriented approach. Task-based learning, very simply, makes a task the central focus of a lesson. So the key there is that the task is in the lesson. So obviously, if you have a lesson of, let's say, 50 minutes or 1 hour, the students are expected to achieve the task within that time period. Project-based learning makes the task the focus of a term or a semester or even an entire school year. It's not unheard of that students work in their groups and they slowly develop the ideas, and they develop the knowledge and the skills and the language that they will require in order to perform the task over the course of an entire year. Now, action-oriented approach isn't different in the sense of what is produced or in the sense of the time period. What makes this approach different is that the student has agency. The student has the opportunity to choose. And it's the fact that the student can choose is the thing that defines the approach. So therefore, and then we'll see this later, if a student is working on a project and the student wants to make some kind of adaptation, or the group of students wants to make an adaptation, a change to that project, then within the ideas of the action-oriented approach, this is very much encouraged, because the idea is that the student is the person who is in control. The student has an important role in the classroom, a role just as important as the teacher. Okay. As you know, the SEP program is currently under review. So we're not sure if it's going to continue to be the action-oriented approach or whether we will return to previous approaches that were used under previous governments. But the concept of action-oriented approach and the concept of project-based learning will be around for a very long time indeed. Educational fashions are very much about giving students a role and giving students a responsibility, and for the students to have a voice in what education they participate in. And I say participate rather than receive, because that is the approach that people take. And the idea of project-based learning is extremely common. This is not something that is limited to English. This is common in a range of different subjects across the school curriculum. And one of the benefits of having this approach common to so many different subjects is that the approach that you decide to take in your English language teaching will also be an approach that they are familiar with, because other teachers teaching other subjects have also taken a very similar approach. So we're going to now have a look at a case study. And this particular case study is taken from this book here. This is Quest 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the differences between task-based learning and project-based learning and the action-oriented approach, and how those different books would tackle this particular material. So here, this is from Unit 4 in Quest 1, and as you can see on the slide, the social purpose of this unit is for students to agree with others on a travel itinerary. So what that means is that when students are going on a trip, then they will need to discuss with the people in their group exactly what they would like to visit, exactly what they would like to see. And the idea is that they will be considering the communicative act. So the communicative act is here about understanding the environment in which the students are operating. So obviously, if the students are in a foreign country, or if the students are in a different city, or if the students are giving recommendations for their own city, then they need to understand all the different places in that particular environment. So if we were taking the approach of task-based learning, then we would think that creating a plan for a field trip is a task that normally you could do in a single lesson. The teacher would have to very carefully define that task, because we would want to have a task in which the students were using particular language and gaining particular knowledge in order to achieve it. The student would have very little opportunity to change that task, and that's a very important element of task-based learning, that it is the task being decided by the teacher rather than the student. However, the student does have the opportunity to use their knowledge and their skills and the strategies and the language that they have picked up in order to complete the task. The difference with project-based learning is that it needs to be a task which is much bigger, that requires much more commitment from the students or from a particular group of students. So here the example, if you can see at the bottom, would be that they could create an itinerary for a field trip. It isn't simply a plan, now it becomes a list of all of the different things that will be done on the field trip and the time they will take place and the logistics of moving to those different places. Obviously, in order to be able to do that, it's necessary to have a lot of information previous to that particular task. So it would be important to have, say, a list of different places and some suggestions and some recommendations, and that will help to build up to the itinerary. And this concept of smaller pieces, smaller tasks, which I will be calling subproducts, we will look at later on in the presentation. So again, here the teacher would define the task, and traditionally, when this approach is taken, then each component leads up to the final product, in which case, for example, the recommendations help to create the plan, which help to create the itinerary. In the action-oriented approach, the emphasis is on the agency of the student, and that allows the student to make adaptations to the task. So, for example, the students may not feel that they are familiar with the concept of field trip. Perhaps they haven't been out with the school and gone to a different place in the city, or gone to a different city, or even a different country. Perhaps for them, the concept of a family holiday is something that they are more familiar with. That is the same communicative act. They are still exchanging ideas about the world about them, about their environment, and it is still the same social practice. They are still agreeing with others on a travel itinerary. The only difference is that now this is for a family holiday instead of a school field trip. But as you can see, even within the action-oriented approach, even with these adaptations that the student chooses to make, the same communicative act is being performed and the same social practice is being carried out. The role of the teacher here is that the teacher has to extremely carefully define what language, skills, and knowledge the students will need in order to perform the communicative act, in order to take part in the social practice. Because if the student simply changes the final project and the teacher does not take those things into consideration, it is entirely possible that different groups may require different language, may require different knowledge, may require different skills. And that is something to be avoided. So if you decide to use the action-oriented approach, what I would definitely recommend is that you think very carefully about what language and what knowledge and what skills your students will require in order to reach the project, and therefore if the student decides to make some kind of adaptation or change, then you will be confident in knowing that although they may take different paths, they will arrive at the same destination. So we're now going to look at the number of different skills, the number of different elements that are involved in project-based and action-oriented learning. The first is that there is an integration of skills through meaningful tasks. So a meaningful task is a task that students engage with, students understand, it is something that is familiar to them, and the integration of skills is pretty much what it sounds like. They will not simply be using the 4 skills in separation. This is not a speaking task. This is not a reading task. What they will be doing is participating in an activity which requires them to speak to their partners, speak to people in the group, obviously listen to other people's opinions. Perhaps they will need to read and do some research and find out more information. And obviously they will need to write particular projects. So they will be using all of their different skills in order to achieve the project. Also here, the emphasis is on the social interaction. So if you see in number 3, it talks about linguistic and social activity. The idea is that we are not focusing on language itself. We are not studying language in order to understand language. The reason that we are looking at language is because we need it for a particular social interaction. And this is what really defines task-based, project-based, and action-oriented learning, in that the reason that you are learning the language is in order to achieve something. This goes back to this idea of learning by doing. Obviously, you don't learn by doing things by yourself. So therefore, interacting with people is incredibly important, and this is why this is called a social practice. There is an idea of socialization. People will work in groups, and there are 2 elements to this. So if you can see in 5 and in 6 there is an idea of group interactions, which means that they are cooperating with each other, they are collaborating, they are sharing ideas, they are coming up with solutions together. Also, as it is a group process, as they are working to accomplish the project, the students will need to produce language, will need particular knowledge, will need particular skills, and the teacher is on hand to help and support them. Okay. So we're going to look at the 3 principal parts which lead to the communicative act. So the very first part is the page content. Now that sounds pretty obvious. The material on the page is what the students will need in order to learn the language and the skills and knowledge that they require for the sub-product. They may learn what is required for the final product at the same time, or simply there may be language that is specific to the sub-product. A sub-product, importantly, is not a fraction of the product. What I mean by that is that a sub-product is not, let's say, 25% of the product. It doesn't mean that if you finish one sub-product, then you will move on to the next sub-product which is not connected, and the next and the next, and by the end you will have a complete product. That is not the idea. The idea is that a sub-product is what scaffolds and supports the learning and helps the students in the development of the final product. So let me give you a clear example. If we are producing a travel itinerary, as we saw in Quest 1 in Unit 4, then one of the things that we will need is a list of places and a list of activities. If we do not know where we can go, if we do not know what we can do, then therefore it is not possible to come up with an itinerary at the end as a final product. So that would be a very important subproduct. The final product, of course, is what helps students to perform the communicative act and the social practice. When students are exchanging ideas about the world around them, about their environment, then students can discuss the contents of the travel itinerary, and they are encouraged to agree with others. So as you can see, the final product helps them to achieve both the communicative act and the social practice. So we're going to move on to a different book now. and this is taken from Quest 2 over here. This is taken from Unit 8. And you can see that what I've done here is I've identified the different components in relation to the content of that particular unit. So obviously the page content runs all the way through the book. So every single page in every single unit has page content. And the activities that you can see there are basically a description of what you would see on every page. At the top, you have the final product. So here, the communicative act is exchanges related to the world around you, and the social practice is complaining about a product. So the idea is that in order to have an exchange which is related to your environment, related to the world around you, an example of that would be complaining about a product, because you will need to be in a shop, you will need to be discussing with the salesperson, discussing perhaps with members of your family in order to help you to complain about the thing that you bought. So this is an exchange of opinions, an exchange of recommendations and suggestions, which is connected to the world around you. Therefore, the complaint is the final product. And the subproducts are all of the different elements that you would need in order to be able to complain. For example, if you wanted to make a complaint about a product, you would need to understand what all of the different problems that you might have with a product. You need to understand how the sales staff will respond to you. You might want to make a role card which explains what each person in the role play will be doing. We also have there something that may seem as a surprise, which is threats and responses. But sometimes you need to say a threat. For example, I'm not going to return to your shop if you don't help me, in order to make your complaint about the product stronger. So all of these are different elements that you will need to understand how to do in order to achieve the final product. Okay, so here you can see the subproducts, and I've already gone through most of the subproducts. So the point that I want to rest on here is that there should be a gradual creation of scaffolding. So what that means is that as students perform the different tasks, and you can imagine each subproduct as a different task, then those tasks should help the students to feel more confident in developing the final product. That's why we use this idea of scaffolding, that it is a psychological support as students engage in producing the final product. So, for example, here the mind map of different possible problems would help students to imagine the situations that they would be in when they are complaining about a product. This would also lead students to consider how they might respond, and of course how the staff would respond. And they might want to make notes on staff responses, and they can use those notes in order to help them form the role cards. As you can see, each subproduct slowly builds up and slowly helps the students to reach and obtain that final product. Okay. So this is a quick look at page content and one particular product step, and to see how they are connected. So here you can see the role cards, and here you can see product step 3. You have a model of what a role card should look like. So therefore, when you are creating the subproduct of a role card, and in product step 3, that is what you need to achieve, that subproduct, then you have a model of how to do it, a model of how to organize it, but also, because on that page they will listen to different examples, you also have a model of the language that they can use. This is another example. Excuse me. So here you have an audio where you are listening to someone making a complaint and someone making threats. And as you can see, the young woman says, "If you don't replace them, I will never shop here again." This we would consider a sensible threat. So what we're looking at in this particular page is the difference between what a sensible threat is and what a threat that would be out of place or exaggerated. One of the things that can often happen, as I'm sure you know, in a role play is that students get sometimes overexcited and like to start to act and dramatize a situation, and it becomes much more exaggerated than it needs to be. And if you introduce the idea of threats and the students become overexcited, then it's entirely possible that they could make all kinds of threats, which normally in a complaint situation would be entirely inappropriate. So therefore, in this particular subproduct, as they are doing a practice role play, they are focusing on which threats would be appropriate to that situation. Just to quickly go back, as you remember, project-based learning is all about learning language and knowledge and skills relevant to a particular situation. So therefore, here it's extremely important that they understand what language is appropriate and what language is inappropriate, and that the students are able to make that decision. Okay, so we also can take side quests, which means we can also take little journeys and go off in different directions, as long as we are achieving the communicative act and the social practice. Those have to be the priority. So, as I've already said, here the communicative act are exchanges related to the world around you. And it's very important that the environment of the complaint is taken into account. So this means that the unit looks at written complaints, phone complaints, and face-to-face complaints, because students need to be able to complain about products in a variety of different situations. The social practice, obviously, is a complaint about a product. And in order to understand this and to give students more information and more language, then you can take these mini journeys, these side quests. So, for example, you could learn about consumer protection laws. In every country, every single consumer has some kind of law that will protect them from buying things that are broken, from buying things that do not work. And therefore, it's useful for students to be able to make reference to those consumer protection laws when they are making the complaint. Another obvious side quest would be writing a complaint letter. In this particular final product, complaining about a product, it's a role play, so they don't need to have a written letter. But it would be very useful for them to develop their written skills by writing a letter or writing an email or engaging in a chat window. Often complaints now are made in chat windows on the internet, and students need to know how to respond using the medium of chat. Something else that would be interesting would be cultural differences in how to complain. So here the role play is making a complaint, but it doesn't say what the where the people have to come from. It doesn't say what culture they have to come from. So you could look at different cultures. Also, complaints are also often made in call centers over the telephone. So you may want to know how life operates in a call center. Finally, something that's often very important in a lesson is personalization. And that simply means relating the final product to something that is personal and pertinent in the students' lives. So for example, students may tell anecdotes about the times that people have complained. Teenagers or younger students, this book obviously is aimed at teenagers, may not have actually complained themselves. Most teenagers will have been with their parents or with a member of their family as they are buying a product, and often they will see it as the responsibility of their parents or the responsibility of their family to make a complaint. However, they will be aware of the results of that complaint and how successful their family was, and they will know what makes a good complaint and what makes a bad complaint. Remember John Dewey's quote that education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. As the students are engaged in life, as students go to shops and as students see complaints, then they are seeing a positive model or a negative model of how to perform that same task. It's the responsibility of us as teachers to provide them with positive models. And by linking what we are doing in the class with what is happening to their friends and families in the real world gives them the opportunity to see that what they are doing in life is helping to educate them and helping getting them ready for future situations. Okay, so just want to conclude by looking at the main ideas of project-based learning. So, as I've mentioned, projects create opportunities for students to use knowledge, skills, attitude, and strategies. Also, it's important to mention that projects create opportunities for students to use language. The focus has to be on the project. So it's important to remember that it isn't simply looking at the language disconnected, looking at the language unrelated to what we are going to do later. It's performing a task and the students knowing that in order to perform that task, they will need particular language knowledge and skills. A very common approach taken when people are engaged in project-based learning is a definition of the project itself. That means that before beginning the project, before taking the quest, and that's the reason for the title, the teacher will sit with the students and together they will discuss what is required in the final project. By understanding what is required, then they will understand what knowledge and skills and strategies they will need to learn on their quest, on their journey towards the final product. Another excellent element of projects is that they can help students reflect on different aspects of language and culture. So as we saw in the previous slide, there are cultural differences between the ways that people complain and the language that they use. An example that has been in the news recently that you may have seen are the riots and the complaints in France. Now, I know that's a much bigger form of complaint, but the Jeunes Gilets are engaged in complaining about an element of their culture. And that particular way of complaining, of having public demonstrations, of having large-scale political movement, is something that is much more relevant to the French culture than, for example, the British culture where I am from. We would typically write a letter and not go out and march and demonstrate in the public. And that an understanding of cultural difference is both interesting for students, but also important for students, because if they are going to engage with different people in the future from different countries, then that's something that they may well need to know. Another important point is that project-based learning makes a task the focus of a whole term, a whole semester, or even a school year. Task-based learning, as we saw at the beginning, will typically finish the task in a single lesson, a 50-minute or 1-hour period. Project-based learning will take the duration of an entire school year, potentially, in order to achieve that project. Therefore, the idea of side quests, as we saw in the previous slide, is extremely important because this adds a degree of richness, a degree of variety, and really motivates the students and interests them in the final product. One thing I also want to focus on is the difference between the action-oriented approach, which was the subject of the webinar in November, and that's still available on Facebook if you want to go back and have a look at that. The action-oriented approach places the emphasis on the agency of the student. So remember when we were talking about students making choices and students adapting the project? Well, that particular approach would be action-oriented. If we were looking at traditional project-based learning, then the teacher would define the project. And as I've already mentioned, but I think it's important to mention again, when you are taking an action-oriented approach, then the teacher must define very carefully what language, what skills, what knowledge are required in the final project, so that if in the first stage, when students are discussing the project and what they are interested in and any changes that they would like to make, then the teacher is aware of what the students will need in order to reach that final project, even if it is different. So here we have, for example, a complaint about a product. We could quite easily imagine a complaint about a service. That complaint about a service could be a complaint about an educational service. We could have a role play where a student is making a complaint to the director of the school or to a board of directors or to a board of parents, board of governors, about the way that they are learning English in the lesson. They may make a complaint about the teacher. That would be a complaint about a service. Now, that's a completely different type of complaint. It's not like returning a broken phone to a store, but it would also achieve the same communicative act. You would have to exchange your opinion, you would have to understand the world around you, your environment, and you would have to also perform a very similar social practice. You would have to make a complaint. The difference here would be that instead of focusing on a product, you would be focusing on a service. Finally, all of the different elements need to be linked. So the page content must lead to the subproduct. What that means is all of the different exercises, the texts, the focus on language, all of the different elements on that page should support and scaffold the students' learning of the language and knowledge and skills. I know I keep repeating these words, but they're very important. The language, knowledge and skills that the students require for a particular subproduct. In the creation of a subproduct, that particular element will be what helps the students to achieve the final product. As I said before, this isn't a fraction of the final product. This isn't a percentage. They don't do 4 different subproducts, each worth 25%, and then they achieve the final product. No, the idea is that there are many different things that you need to know. There are many different ways you need to express yourself. There are many different skills that you need in order to achieve this final product. And each subproduct, each task will help you to develop everything that you need in order to achieve the final product. It is important also, of course, that the final product is articulated, is connected with the communicative act and the social practice. Therefore, all of these different elements must connect together, and the unit as a whole, in the case of the book, or the project, in the case of your classroom, must all lead towards the final product, which allows students to perform the communicative act and the social practice. Okay, thank you very much. we will now have some time for questions. So your questions are going to be communicated to me, and in a few moments I will be looking at your questions, and I will be able to respond to you and answer any ideas you have. So please feel free to ask me any question you like. Please feel free to express any confusion, any doubt you may have. And also, if you would like to ask me questions about things that are not directly related to the presentation that we saw today, that perhaps touch on a different theme that is connected to project-based learning, or that is connected, to the action-oriented approach, which is what Eduardo looked at in November, then I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. I hope that you managed to understand everything I say. I know that listening to a British accent sometimes can be difficult for an international audience, so hopefully it wasn't too confusing for you. And if you want to go back and listen to this presentation, then you obviously know that there are 2 Facebook channels that you can have a look at. One is Facebook / University of Dayton Publishing, and that is the presentation in English. And there is also Facebook / SM, which has the Spanish audio that you can listen to again. So, do I have this material? So Alejandra Martinez Rubio is asking me if there is material to consult. Obviously, you will have this presentation on Facebook, and you can go back and also refer to the previous presentation that Eduardo made in November. Those presentations will sit on the University of Dayton Publishing Facebook page and the SM Facebook page for some time to come, and you're free to go back and consult that. Also, of course, we do have the material, which is the Quest textbook. Gabriela Boyan is asking me if I personally have created material about project-based learning. No, I have not. I am a teacher, I am an editor, but I do not produce academic material. Thank you very much, Blanca, who's congratulating me on the topic. I'm glad it was helpful. Hopefully, you'll be able to use it immediately in your classroom and to put it into practice. So do we have any other questions? Let me just quickly remind you that you can always come to the SM bookshop where we have these books on display, and you can buy them and use them in your classroom. Luis Medina is asking me what the difference is between learning based on a project and learning based on challenges. That's a very interesting question. So a project has to be defined. The key is that a project has to be something that you produce at the end of a set period of time. Challenges do not necessarily have a final product. For example, when you complain about a product, then you are producing a complaint. When you write a letter of complaint, there is a physical object. When you are making a complaint in an email, there is a physical object. Even when you're making a complaint in a store, you are still producing something. There is a moment in time. However, a challenge may be speaking for a period of time, or maybe writing a piece of writing inspired by a particular idea. It doesn't mean that you are creating a final product. And that, I think, is the principal difference between project-based learning and learning based on challenges. Okay, I'm just waiting to see if there are any other questions coming in, and there are. This is the fun of being on Facebook Live, that we are doing everything live. So please bear with me as I am waiting for further questions. Something I would just like to point out is that project-based learning is a technique that has been used for a very long time. Please don't feel that it is a fashion or related to any particular syllabus. We've already discussed the idea of the difference between learning based on a project and learning based on challenges. And I think that's probably the most challenging question that we've had today. So thank you very much, Luis, for that question. Are there sample books in Argentina? The Quest books are not currently available in Argentina. However, obviously, we're always open to ideas of adaptations and changes. So please get in touch with your SM office, with your University of Dayton Publishing office in Argentina if you think that would be a good idea, and we would be more than happy to work on that project. Adaptations for different international markets is one of the things that we often engage in here in UDP. So we are always interested in future projects. So thank you very much, Elena, for that question. Okay. Teo Smith is asking me if the next transmission will be in Spanish. Sorry. Okay. So yes. There is going to be a webinar in Spanish following this. Gabriela Boyan is asking me about a project which involves several subjects: math, English, and history. And I think that's a really important question. So one of the benefits of the project-based learning approach is that projects are an environment for a huge range of skills. So if we go back to this idea of complaining about a product, obviously you would need to be able to have the use of maths. So for example, if you were given a 25% discount and then you look at your receipt and actually you've only been given a 20% discount, I know that's a bit of a strange example, but I'm just thinking off the top of my head, then that would be a good way for students to practice percentages in English. The question also was about history. If we think about the example from Quest 1, where we were making a travel itinerary, well, clearly that would be an excellent opportunity to learn the history of the place that we were visiting and the history of all of the different monuments. And based on the history that we found most interesting, then perhaps that would be a good way to decide which places we would like to go to and what we would like to do during our trip. And Gabriela asking a related question is whether I believe that this applies to any subject. And to be honest, I do. And I think if I just quickly go back to her previous question, which was about a combination of subjects, then that really is the benefit of project-based learning. That it isn't simply studying one single subject. If you as a teacher would like to take the opportunity to teach a variety of different subjects, and obviously now considering we're discussing English language teaching, we are looking at CLIL, or Content Language Integrated Learning, then the content taken from different subjects and learnt in English would be an excellent use of project-based learning. You could, for example, if we go back to the example from Quest 1, where we were looking at a travel itinerary, you could look at geography, you could look at history, you could look at the economics of the area. There are a huge range of different subjects that you could include. Silvana Simonetti has mentioned working in groups. And what she's asking, and this is a very important practical question, is how would you grade the students? Now, often teachers are concerned because they know at the end of the school year, they need to produce an individual grade for each student. And if students are working in groups, then it is sometimes difficult to separate the activity of the different students and separate out how each student performs in a task. That, for me, is the significant difference between task-based learning and project-based learning. Remember, project-based learning takes place over an entire semester, takes place over an entire school year. Therefore, there are plenty of opportunities to practice different types of speaking, to practice writing, to assess students' listening, to assess students' reading, because there will be a lot of different subtasks, and there will be lots of different opportunities for you as a teacher to assess how well the students understand a particular listening, or how well students understand a particular reading, or their writing ability, or their spoken ability. The particular final product, a complaint, obviously, because it's a role play, is a spoken activity. And therefore, you would probably have a role play in pairs, where you are able to listen to each person in the pair and give them assessment. But that's just the final product. There are many, many subproducts that are related to that, and each one of those subproducts will give them an opportunity to practice different skills, which then they can be individually assessed on. So I totally understand the concern. Obviously, as teachers, we are obliged to produce lots of evaluation. We're obliged to produce lots of different numbers and grades for our students, and they all have to be on an individual basis. But one of the most attractive elements of project-based learning is you are giving students numerous opportunities for their learning, numerous opportunities for them to practice different skills, and consequently, numerous opportunities for you as a teacher to grade their development. Also, I think one thing I would like to touch on while we're discussing grades is the final product is not the final grade necessarily. What we can do as teachers is give our students, feedback on each individual subproduct. Give them feedback on each individual stage. The benefit of that is that we are allowing students to understand how they are developing. So just to quickly touch on another subject, the idea of formative evaluation and formative assessment. By using the multiple stages of project-based learning, you have multiple opportunities to let students know how they are developing and what they need to work on. This means that students are very aware of how they are developing as learners, and therefore they can use those opportunities to improve. So for example, if we go back to this complaints idea, if they need to make a written complaint, then perhaps you would give them feedback on their writing so that the next opportunity they have for writing, they would be able to improve that. So excellent question. Thank you very much, Silvana. And I think that does illustrate extremely well one of the main advantages of project-based learning. So any other questions for now? Okay. So thank you very much. As I said, this will be available on Facebook, University of Data and Publishing, and the Spanish version will be available on Facebook SM, and it will stay there for some time to come. Thank you very much, and it was a great pleasure to give this webinar today.